This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from all around the globe. Get an entire month free at mubi.com/finalgirlstudios. For more essay content, be sure to check out Final Girl Digital on Substack. Link below.
We're now going to look at one side of the fashion business that's concerning many, the growing number of young girls on the catwalks who are as thin as rakes. Is this really the image that the fashion business want to portray?
Today, the president blasted designers who use the heroin look to sell their clothes.
Which came first, the super wafer's modern-day icon or the generation of anorexia-afflicted girls?
Trend from the 90s might be making a comeback. A renewed obsession with the ultra-thin look called heroin chic is popping up on fashion runways as well as social media.
Susan Sontag opens up her 1978 critical work, Illness as Metaphor, with the following. Illness is the night side of life, a more onerous citizenship. Everyone who is born holds dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and in the kingdom of the sick. Although we also prefer to use only the good passport, sooner or later each of us is obliged, at least for a spell, to identify ourselves as citizens of that other place. I want to describe not what it is really like to immigrate to the kingdom of the ill and live there, but the punitive or sentimental fantasies concocted about the situation. Not real geography, but stereotypes of national character. My subject is not physical illness itself, but the uses of illness as a figure or metaphor. In recent months, a familiar face seems to have returned. Girls grace editorial spreads with hollow cheeks and slender frames, their skin often pale, and their eyes rimmed with dark eyeliner, their faces gaunt. This appearance has inspired viral online headlines such as The Cult of the Disassociative Pout and Succubus Chic get to know the deadly new it girl. Though these headlines frame the trend with a sense of whimsy and dark glamour, there is a haunting predecessor that looms in the shadows waiting to bite. Many of us know her by the name Heroin Chic. The looming threat of the return of Heroin Chic seems to be on the radar of many. Beauty has a long history of favoring girls when they look sickly. But why? Part 1. Consumptive Chic. In order to understand the impact of heroin chic, we first must examine its predecessor, consumptive chic. The term, coined by journalist Carolyn A. Day, refers to the influence of tuberculosis, then commonly called consumption, had on beauty standards. Annie Leal Slaughter writes, in the era of tuberculosis chic, when tuberculosis, or consumption as it was then named, ravaged 18th and 19th century Europe, it was artists, poets, and writers who crafted outlandish portrayals of the terrible illness in a feverish frenzy to make its fatal effects easier to grasp. While the disease exterminated the masses, causing bouts of bloody hacking fits, debilitating pain in the lungs, and endless days of exhaustion, visual artists used their tools to wash away the sorrow, depicting the angst of the consumptive as if it were nothing short of beautiful. Thus, a period of glamorizing the dead, or soon-to-be, was born. Tuberculosis was heavily romanticized. It was an illness that was believed to have targeted poets and artists, but most importantly, it was an illness that was said to increase the beauty of women. Those suffering with the disease often grew pale and thin, their cheeks flushed, and their eyes wide and sunken. These qualities became synonymous with beauty standards across Europe and North America. Henry David Thoreau mused in his journal, "Disease and decay are often beautiful, like the pearly tear of the shellfish or the hectic glow of consumption." The admiration of the sick and dying body was echoed in the 18th century magazine that declared, "The beauty of women is greatly owing to their delicacy," or weakness. 19th century actress Eliza Poe was the prime representation of consumptive chic, with her rosy cheeks and alabaster skin, wide eyes, and tiny waifish body, all a result of suffering from tuberculosis. She was widely admired and praised for her tubercular beauty during her life, though it was cut short at just the age of 24 when she died due to the illness. In her passing, she left behind a son, who was just 2 years old at the time of her death. His mother's passing and her beauty would go on to have a lasting impact on the boy who grew up to become a famous poet we know as Edgar Allan Poe. Poe's poetry and stories often included women of a similar tubercular beauty, often describing women as pale and wispy with very large eyes. Edgar Allan Poe, too, later died of tuberculosis at the age of 40. We see the lasting impact of this beauty standard not just in trends such as heroin chic, but also in the work of Gothic expressions of beauty. Tim Burton, for example, has cited Poe as a formative influence, and his characters often echo that same tubercular look. Pale skin, skeletal limbs, oversized eyes. An aesthetic Burton has come to be synonymous with. Women during this time were encouraged to stay out of the sun in order to stay pale. They applied belladonna to their eyelids to dilate their pupils to give the illusion of a wide-eyed, consumptive appearance, and rouge to their cheeks to replicate the fevered flush of illness. Magazines gave detailed instructions on how to recreate the look of a woman in the throes of decline. The romanticization of tuberculosis appeared not only in literature but also in painting and early photography, imagery that would be later echoed in heroin chic. Susan Sontag wrote in Illness as Metaphor, "Tuberculosis is celebrated as the disease of born victims, of sensitive, passive people who are not quite life-loving enough to survive. What is hinted at by the yearning but almost somnolent belles of pre-Raphaelite art is made explicit in the emaciated, hollow-eyed tubercular girls depicted by Edward Munch. And while the standard representation of a death from tuberculosis places the emphasis on the perfect sublimation of feeling, the recurrent figure of the tubercular courtesan indicates that tuberculosis was always thought to make the sufferer sexy." By the early 20th century, advances in medicine and public health began to diminish the threat of tuberculosis in the West. By the mid-1950s, cases had dropped dramatically in the U.S., and by the 1970s, the disease had all but disappeared. Consumptive chic faded from fashion, but the image of the beautiful, sickly woman, frail, pale, and on the verge of death, lingered. The image was later repackaged and resold under a new name: heroin chic. Part 2. Heroin chic. Seemingly just as the artists of the world were no longer dying of tuberculosis, a new epidemic took hold: heroin. Writers such as William Burroughs, visual artists such as Basquiat, and musicians such as Lou Reed and Janis Joplin all struggled with heroin addiction, many dying as a result. Like tuberculosis before it, heroin developed a sort of cult-like status, steeped in the myth of the suffering artist. Dying from heroin, like dying from tuberculosis, became romanticized, a sort of tragic fate reserved for poets, writers, and artists. And as with tuberculosis, the romanticization of heroin brought with it a new beauty ideal for women to aspire to. Gia Karanji, sometimes referred to as the first supermodel, is often cited as the sort of tragic figurehead of heroin chic, though never by her own design. Many are familiar with her story through Gia 1998, the HBO biopic starring Angelina Jolie, which charts Gia's rise to stardom as a supermodel and her fall from grace as she struggled with addiction. Gia, however, was not glamorized or romanticized for her addiction while she was alive. Rather, she was actually ostracized and cast aside by the fashion world as soon as her addiction became inconvenient.
Down there, that's it. Beautiful.
She became erratic. In time, her work was affected.
At one point, you got kind of into the drug scene, didn't you?
Yes, you could say that I did. It kind of creeps up on you and catches you in a world that's, none that anyone will ever know except someone that has been there.
Famously, no one from the fashion world attended her funeral when she died of AIDS, which she contracted from a used heroin needle. Only in death was Gia mythologized. Heroin chic took on its more glamorous connotations in the 90s, as heroin use began rising among the upper and middle classes. As Henry Giro writes in Heroin Chic, The Politics of Seduction, in the 1990s, heroin became the drug of choice for upper-middle-class professionals who did not want to compromise their power or advantage social positions, but who wanted to escape from the boredom of their lives. Heroin use in the mid-1990s became a cultural signifier amongst the rich, famous, and trendy for combining the cool posture of alienation and the chilling willingness to appropriate what was considered the outlaw fashion accessory. Another central figure in the heroin chic narrative is photographer David Sorrenti. When I looked up Sorrenti's work, I was immediately struck with this instant familiarity with so many of his images. I had been reblogging his work on Tumblr since my early teens with no idea of the tragic background or profound influence this teen had on the fashion world. Sorrenti suffered from thalassemia, a rare blood disorder that kept him in and out of hospitals throughout his short life. Due to this, he spent a lot of time in hospitals and was confronted from a young age by the idea of death, and his work reflects that intimacy with mortality. He died at just 20 years old from kidney failure, believed to be exacerbated by his heroin use. On May 20th, 1997, the New York Times ran a front-page story titled, "A Death Tarnishes Fashion's Heroin Look." The article, written by Amy Spindler, a friend of the Sorrenti family, opened with, after years of denial by the fashion industry that heroin use amongst its players had any relation to the so-called heroin chic style of photography, the fatal overdose of David Sorrenti, a promising photographer at the heart of the scene, was like a small bomb going off. Spindler worked with Sorrenti's mother to speak out about drug use in the industry. She later wrote, "The eerie silence in the fashion industry immediately following Mr. Sorrenti's death may have reflected a sense of complicity. Just as with Gia, the industry mourned its lost youth only when it was too late. Two youth who changed the fashion industry and were in part exploited by it, though were promptly swept under the rug when their addictions ultimately led to their demise." The next day, President Bill Clinton addressed growing public concerns, stating in a televised speech,
"For most people in our generation, those of you who are, a lot of you are younger than I am, but most of you about my age, we all grew up thinking heroin was the worst thing in the world. There were these horrible images associated with it. Strung out junkies lying on street corners in decidedly unglamorous ways. Cocaine use goes down, heroin use comes up. For most people in our generation, those of you who are, a lot of you are younger than I am, but most of you about my age, but we now see in college campuses and neighborhoods heroin becoming increasingly the drug of choice. And we know that part of this has to do with the images that are finding their way to our young people, not methamphetamines. In the press in recent days, we've seen reports that many of our fashion leaders are now admitting, and I honor them for doing this, they're admitting flat out that images projected in fashion photos in the last few years have made heroin addiction seem glamorous and sexy and cool. And as some of the people in those images start to die now, it's become obvious that that is not true. You do not need to glamorize addiction to sell clothes.
With this speech, heroin chic became a household term, but most of the young artists that were now being dubbed heroin chic were genuine. Sorrenti was a teenager when he produced the majority of his work, documenting the genuine experiences of those around him. In a 1996 LA Times article, Robin Juvan wrote, "Fashion didn't conjure up the look of zoned-out kids. Designers copied this from the street, from the addicts themselves. They cleaned it up, validated it, and now they're selling it." Fashion by its nature romanticizes. Editorial photography is not documentary, it's stylized and aestheticized. Many of the artists from the heroin chic era have cited drawing from the rawness of Larry Clark's photojournalism in the 1960s and Nan Goldin's in the 1970s. Many of David's images, now criticized, especially those of Jamie King, Sorrenti's girlfriend at the time, were deeply personal. They weren't part of a marketing campaign. They were two teenagers making art while living through illness and addiction. Jamie King later expressed frustration that these photographs had been twisted into a cautionary spectacle.
All of these people started turning all of the images that we had made, and they're like, oh, this is the image of heroin chic.
The artists themselves were not referring to the era as heroin chic, nor defining the aesthetic of their photos as an overt representation of heroin use. The term was coined after the fact at David's funeral by editor Ingrid Sishi, who declared, "This is heroin. This isn't chic. This has got to stop."
There's always this idea that if you blame somebody, it will fix the problem, as opposed to actually really addressing the problem, which was, why are all these kids who are 16 to 18 feeling so despondent that they have to take drugs?
Though primarily associated with fashion, heroin chic extended beyond the confines of fashion into music and film. Fiona Apple's Criminal music video and Nirvana's Visual World both borrowed from this imagery. The grunge subculture overlapped heavily with heroin chic because it didn't exist in a fashion vacuum, and was rather born out of the young adults who were experiencing the culture firsthand. It reflected the lived experiences of youth at the time.
When I met Mario, the way that fashion photography was done at that particular time was very glossy. It was all about these big Herculean girls, big hairdos, big shoulder pads. And there was a movement from Europe which basically had a whole group of younger photographers who were influenced by the grunge movement here. The emerging sensibility was kind of a reaction to an existing establishment.
Though Spindler noted in the New York Times that unlike the film or music industries, which had at least attempted interventions, the fashion world did little to support its young people. And in that same article, Ingrid Sishi elaborated, "The issue is to know the difference between mindless, unconscious commercialism that's being done in the name of edginess and truth versus real truth. One can always tell the difference between a photograph that has substance and one that's just abusing the mirror to life that photography can be. Those are the pictures that cheapen human life." In the documentary See No Evil, it's suggested that the tone of photography in the 1990s darkened, not just David's, but everyone's. This wasn't simply aesthetic subversion, but a cultural response. The early 1990s was marked by economic recession, widening class divides, and political disillusionment. This contributed to youth not relating to the polished, glamorous fashion world of the 1980s. Though Clinton's speech made heroin chic a household term, it failed to address the systemic injustice that contributed to heroin chic and the role his administration played in the culture of drug use amongst youth. As Giro wrote, in expanding poverty, unemployment, and race-based assaults on young people through the dismantling of welfare services and the passing of repressively harsh laws that criminalize and unfairly target poor, young Black men. Clinton, it would seem, used fashion and young artists as a scapegoat to avoid addressing systemic issues of drug use amongst youth. Mario Sorrenti, David's older brother, described how many of the photographers who were associated with what was suddenly being dubbed heroin chic were unable to find work because no one wanted to be associated with them.
All of a sudden we were just attacked. It was bad, it was negative. We really wanted to try and mourn in privacy. It just became this huge public scandal.
It kills that whole era of photography altogether. All the young talents are no longer working because they can't find work because, we cannot do heroin chic because, advertising wouldn't stand for it. Instead of nurturing these people, it's all wiped out.
Henry Giro continues, confusing the reality of human suffering with an aesthetic that celebrates a politics of despair and pathology, heroin chic does more than generate images in which the lure of cheap sensation is tied to fast money and quick notoriety. Heroin chic also bespeaks a privatized space where art and commerce can withdraw to shield themselves and their viewers from any sense of public accountability. Heroin chic must be engaged in more general terms as symptomatic of a market-driven culture that encourages the larger society to view young people as symbols of social degeneracy while simultaneously treating them as both disposable and as an industrial reserve army of consumers. Heroin chic celebrates a society that mocks the poor, increasingly incarcerates its youth, and wages war against people of color. Its brief rise to prominence signals a broader, retrograde public discourse that shares its mocking indifference and celebrates its debased appropriation of the other as an amusing spectacle. Heroin chic offers a postmodern form of cultural slumming as cheap titillation for its yuppie audience, whose members imagine themselves being reckless and edgy as they appropriate the behaviors, dress, modes of speaking, and experience of those who occupy the most tragic margins of society. One of the most disturbing threads that weaves tuberculosis and heroin chic together is the role of white supremacy in shaping both aesthetics and the myths around illness. During the height of tuberculosis, many white doctors in the US and Europe claimed that only white people were susceptible to the disease, often referring to it as the white man's plague. One American physician wrote that tuberculosis was a disease of the master race, not of the slave race. As late as 1880, white American doctors argued that Black Americans could not contract tuberculosis, claiming that they lacked the intellectual refinement and temperament to be affected by the white plague. When Robert Koch identified tuberculosis as a bacterial infection in 1982, public understanding shifted, but the white supremacist ideology did not. Once it was acknowledged that the Black population was actually dying from tuberculosis in disproportionate numbers, the disease became a new vehicle for racism. In 1896, one white doctor claimed that Black patients had higher death rates of tuberculosis due to a smaller chest capacity, a blatantly racist and biologically false assertion. In truth, systemic oppression was the cause. Black communities were more likely to live in impoverished conditions and were more likely to suffer from malnutrition and had reduced access to medical care. A century later, heroin followed a similar arc. As heroin use became prevalent among the wealthy and white in the 1990s, public perception of the drug altered and the stigma softened. The AIDS epidemic made injecting heroin with a needle increasingly dangerous, so snorting became the more common mode of heroin use, further distancing the drug from the image of the poor, marginalized junkie. This changed the stigma surrounding the drug and allowed heroin to find a new market amongst the middle and upper class, in contrast to its previous market amongst the poor and marginalized. The rebranding of heroin as a drug of the fashionable elite allowed it to be aestheticized, celebrated, and mythologized. And with both the romanticization of tuberculosis and heroin use, although the wealthy and white are able to leave illness and addiction behind as the trends fade, marginalized communities are not so fortunate. In Canada and the United States, Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in residential schools where tuberculosis rates rose quickly. A 1907 report noted that conditions were so poor, it was almost as if the prime conditions for the outbreak of epidemics had been deliberately caused. The death rate of tuberculosis in Canadian residential schools remains to be one of the most devastating medical atrocities in modern history. While tuberculosis has all but disappeared from the cultural consciousness of white Canadians, it remains a living reality for many Indigenous communities. John Green writes in Everything is Tuberculosis, the Canadian Public Health Association has estimated that in First Nations communities, around 700 of every 100,000 people died annually of tuberculosis in the 1930s and 1940s. Indigenous people were more than 10 times as likely to die of tuberculosis than white Canadians, but in residential schools, the rate was 8,000 per 100,000, meaning that 8% of all kids confined in these schools died of tuberculosis each year. And these inequities persist. Today, Inuit people are over 400 times more likely to contract tuberculosis than white Canadians. As Lena Fost and Courtney Heffernan have written, these deaths should not be diminished as an unavoidable consequence of a long-standing epidemic, but as a result of a deliberate neglect and mistreatment on the part of the architects of the residential school system. People who are treated as less than fully human by the social order are more susceptible to tuberculosis, but it's not because of their moral codes or choices or genetics. It's because they are treated as less than fully human by the social order. And the story repeats today with opioids. Today, heroin and synthetic opioids are among the leading causes of death for Indigenous people in Canada. Although Indigenous people make up just 2.6% of the national population, they account for 10% of all overdose deaths. Indigenous women are 8 times more likely to endure a non-fatal overdose and 5 times more likely to endure a fatal overdose than non-Indigenous women. Giro expands on this systemic context in another passage, writing, "The new art of heroin chic in fashion photography points to a politics of representation that must be understood in relation to the current right-wing assault on working-class youth and women. Heroin chic does more than maximize the pleasure of viewing by glamorizing the aesthetics of cultural slumming. It also reinforces a cynicism that permeates large parts of the public sector in which the bodies of youth and women are no longer viewed within the privileged space of possibility. Agency in this view is devoid of any sense of future. Bodies presented within stylized images that are anorexic, physically abused, and paralyzed from substance abuse do not evoke sympathy or compassion, but work largely to reinforce our image of youth as symbols of violence, crime, and social disorder, and of women as simply sexualized commodities." As we move deeper into an era defined by alt-right ideology, rising xenophobia, transphobia, and the renewed romanticization of nihilism, this pattern is one we should be most skeptical of. The aesthetics of suffering may once again be repackaged for mass consumption, stripped of context, history, or consequence, marketed to the privileged under the guise of edginess or authenticity, but the prices of these aesthetics is always paid by those who cannot afford to treat suffering as a trend. Part 3. The alleged return of heroin chic. So, where does the legacy of tuberculosis and heroin chic leave us today? I think there is understandably an impulse to brush aside the heroin chic era and all the art that came out of it as entirely bad, though I can't help but have an affinity for certain aspects of this era. I'd be lying if I said I didn't draw inspiration from this era. I mean, as I mentioned, I have been reblogging Sorrenti's photos on Tumblr since I was a teenager, and my filming setup inspiration is a combination of Fiona Apple's Criminal music video and Chloe Sevigny in an X-Girl short film, both of whom have associations with the heroin chic era. One of my favorite films as a teenager is Gia 1998, and I've always loved Kate Moss. I came of age during 2014 Tumblr grunge, and I love modern photographers that are drawing inspiration from this raw, gritty era like Stolen Bezos. I think nuance can exist, and I think we can admire aspects of aesthetics while being critical. When I read these headlines or panicked social media posts about skinny being back, I can't help but feel like there's been a cultural misreading that skinny was ever really out of fashion. Thinness has never really left. Despite Bill Clinton's speech, the death of the grungier aesthetic known as heroin chic did not stop heroin use, nor did it dismantle the worship of slim bodies. The gaunt silhouettes of the 90s were simply repackaged in the 2000s, now wrapped in bubblegum pink and rhinestones and platinum blonde hair, seen in icons such as Paris Hilton or Nicole Richie. Or in fashion, we saw the rise of the Slavic dolls. Though there were attempts at inclusivity in the 2000s, such as the 2004 Dove Beauty campaign, when most of us think of the 2000s, we overwhelmingly remember skinny bodies and how horribly women in the public eye were scrutinized for not fitting such a narrow standard of beauty. What we've seen across the last century is a sort of pendulum swinging between health as trend and then sickness as trend.
Everything you could say about the 80s, had an opposite reaction in the 90s.
The era that we're currently emerging out of, in many ways, mirrors the 80s. Polished and glossy and aspirational, built around fitness and wellness. While the era that we are entering resembles heroin chic in its subversion of that polish. The recent rise and fall of the Pilates princesses recalls the aerobics culture of the 1980s, and just as the grunge of the 90s was a reaction to that glossy decade, So too was the indie sleaze of the 2000s a response to the hyper-groomed glam era of the Y2K era. When I interviewed indie sleaze photographer Mark Hunter, he emphasized that his work, like much of that time, was born from a reaction to the overproduced beauty of the 2000s McBling era. In the early 2010s, we saw again the rise of Victoria's Secret bombshells, bronzed, toned, and glowing with health, but even then, the pro-Anna Tumblr grunge era flourished in the margins, eerily echoing heroin chic with its frail bodies, cool-toned photography, and sad girl detachment. Many of us were even reblogging Sorrenti's photography from the heroin chic era on our Tumblr blogs, such as myself, as I've mentioned. And then by the mid to late 2010s, we had entered the height of the BBL era, defined by Facetune, slim thick bodies, and an influx of influencers and the normalization of fillers and Botox. Now we are watching another pivot, the return of heroin chic, the revival of indie sleaze, the rise of succubus chic, and the disassociative pout. The aesthetic is messier, grungier. The eyeliner isn't the perfect wing of the 2010s, it's smudged now. The girls are getting their filler dissolved, and they're doing ketamine and coke on the weekends instead of Pilates and green juices. I don't deny the work of genuine body positivity activists during the 2010s, but I believe the movement was quickly co-opted by corporate interest in order to just sell more. Just like the art of heroin chic was once commodified by fashion, body positivity was absorbed, neutered, and sold back to us in palatable packaging. These aesthetic shifts aren't random, they're part of a marketing cycle. Whether you're slim, thick, or skin and bones, your body is a vessel for consumption. You exist to consume and be consumed. Gia Tolentino critiques this cycle in Trick Mirror. The default assumption tends to be that it is politically important to designate everyone as beautiful. We have hardly tried to imagine what it might look like if our culture could do the opposite, to de-escalate the situation, make beauty matter less. Women's choices are constrained and dictated by social expectations and by the arbitrary dividends of beauty work, which is more rewarding if one is young and rich and conventionally attractive to begin with. In any case, Widows argues the fact of choice does not make an unjust or exploitative practice or act somehow magically just or non-exploitative. The timidity in mainstream feminism to admit that women's choice, not just our problems, are in the end political has led to the vision of women's empowerment that often feels brutally disempowering in the end. The root of this trouble is the fact that mainstream feminism has had to conform to patriarchy and capitalism to become mainstream in the first place. Old requirements, instead of being overthrown, are rebranded. Beauty work is labeled self-care to make it sound progressive. In 2017, Taffy Brodesser-Akner wrote a story for the New York Times Magazine about the new vocabulary of weight loss, noting the way women's magazines replace covers like, "Get lean, control your eating" with, "Be your healthiest, get strong." People started fasting and eating clean and cleansing and making lifestyle changes, Brodesser-Akner wrote, which by all available evidence is exactly like dieting. It sometimes seems that feminism can imagine no more satisfying progress than this current situation, one in which instead of being counseled by mid-century magazines to spend time and money trying to be more radiant for our husbands, we can now counsel one another to do all the same things, but for ourselves. Tolentino continues, athleisure can be viewed as a sort of late capitalist fetish wear. It is what you buy when you are compulsively gratified by the prospect of increasing your body's performance on the market. Heroin chic, the indie sleaze revival, 2014 grunge are all aesthetics that are trending at the moment because they are all aesthetics that are in conversation with one another. It's honestly easier to name and identify the brief eras in which this consumptive standard defined by sickly, frail, pale beauty was dormant, rather than to trace its revivals. It seems as though even in the eras where this consumptive chic beauty standard dulled, it never fully leaves us. We see this dynamic in the viral Dage Digital piece, Succubus Chic, Get to Know the Deadly New It Girl, where Alex Peters emphasizes the rising style amongst women that resembles the tubercular and heroin chic features of beauty. The cool girl is dead. The Ghoul Girl killed her. It's Bad Girl Angelina Jolie in her blood vial era. It's Wednesday Addams if she grew up, got a job in Milan, and picked up a coke habit. It's Arca's long, jet black hair with a 90s skinny eyebrow and a succubus smolder. Cheeks are hollow and cheekbones are prominent. There's not 1 ounce of buccal fat in sight. This aesthetic comes as we've been seeing a gradual shift away from the focus on wellness, skincare, and the clean girl look towards a messier indie sleaze vibe. Or in the cult of the disassociative pout, why this lobotomy chic dead-eyed pose is taking over your Instagram feed, where Rain Fisher Kwan observes the way in which a rising selfie trend points to a rising sense of nihilism amongst youth. The duck-face selfie was inherently admissive of its goal, explicit and unabashed in its performance. But if the poses before it were conscious of the self, the goal of the disassociative pout is to perform the sullen detachment from it. As constructed as they are, our posting habits often inadvertently reveal something intimate about our fears, needs, and desires, so it only makes sense that our fatigue would present itself there too. And when the duck-facing of the optimistic 2010s proved too tiresome, perhaps it was inevitable that our lips would land in a pout. When I first conceptualized making this video, it was a couple years ago, and I was laying in a hospital bed reading Illness's Metaphor by Susan Sontag when I noticed many of her assertions about tuberculosis deeply paralleled our culture's treatment of heroin chic, mental illness, and eating disorders, and I found it ironic given the fact that I myself was being treated for my own mental health struggles. And at one point, I was a teenager who found refuge in the romanticization of my own depression on Tumblr. And that I've always found myself drawn in a way to these aesthetics that parallel these characteristics without seeing the thread that wove them together. The romanticization of frail, sick bodies has not went away. Today, we lack the specificity of a specific ailment to romanticize. Instead, we aestheticize the abstract concept of suffering, holding the same connotations as tuberculosis with the idea of she's so beautiful and frail and sad because she's so melancholic and misunderstood. Not because she has tuberculosis, she's probably just on Lexapro. Our lack of specificity leads us to these headlines that say things like the disassociative pout or lobotomy chic, and instead of heroin chic, these articles reference ketamine and coke use. The specifics have changed, but the underlying aesthetic impulses have not, further highlighting our culture's fixation on mental illness and addiction, determined to make it into something trendy and fashionable. Perhaps in a way, it's not so different from the heroin chic artists who were merely documenting their experiences of heroin use. Our generation is plagued by mental illness, so we lightheartedly incorporate it into our aesthetics because how could we ignore it? Maybe we're just being honest. Everyone is depressed and detached. Everyone is on Lexapro or Prozac or Zoloft. Everyone is doing ketamine and coke recreationally. As Henry Giro writes, in a postmodern world, consumption rather than production drives the capitalist economy. Within this new capitalist formation, culture is more than commercialized. It is emptied of resistance as critical reflection gives way to the reified image of the spectacle. Failing to discern the difference between reality as fact and reality as possibility, between a morality committed to addressing forms of oppression and a representation politics in which oppression, suffering, and despair are translated into stylized aesthetic, the market-driven culture realm demonstrates an apocalyptic emptiness. As the machineries of cultural pedagogy extend beyond the school into the largely corporate-controlled, electronically based media of communication, the realities of personal experience and collective memory are transformed into a cartoon utopia, dressed up as entertainment. Within such a representational politics, commerce emerges as the bearer of a refreshing kind of art, a new form of cultural production elevating the aesthetic as its most important organizing principle. Culture and commodity become indistinguishable, and social identities are shaped almost exclusively within the ideology of consumerism. Trading out the farce of body positivity for the grungier, heroin chic indie sleaze revival, It's like trading out cockroaches for rats. The problem is that the house is infested, not about which vermin it's infested with. Heroin chic is not the problem. It's a symptom of a problem, of a culture that is in a constant flux of marketing health as a chic new trend, to then marketing sickness as a chic new trend, and then flip-flopping between these two to keep the population perpetually ill and grasping at fleeting beauty standards. The female frame within a patriarchal capitalist society is a vessel in which to express aesthetic capital. Corporations never cared about your well-being, and they never will. They only spoon-fed you body diversity because that's what was profitable. And that is why, as soon as they could, Vogue hired Gigi Hadid of all people to star in a Hairspray tribute. Yes, they hired the blonde, skinny white girl to do a tribute to the John Waters musical about fat phobia and anti-blackness. As Theory of the Young Girl states, from working out to anti-wrinkle creams and liposuction, the young girl's determination is the same regardless: to disregard her body and make her body an abstraction. Within a capitalist patriarchal framework, the feminine form has been allotted as a vessel to sell, to consume and be consumed. Beauty becomes the most sought after and valuable currency for women. Illness as metaphor for beauty seems to highlight women's dedication to preserving their place as the dolls of capital, abandoning the flesh and molding one's frame for what is trending at the time. Consumptive chic, heroin chic, and its inevitable successors beg us to question, how far towards death will you go in order to preserve your place within the hierarchy of feminine performance? Mubi is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the globe. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there is always something new to discover. Recently, I have loved watching Charli XCX Alone Together, a documentary that chronicles Charli XCX turning quarantine restrictions into artistic inspiration, making an album in 5 weeks during lockdown. From DIY recording sessions to live stream confessions, this kaleidoscopic documentary captures the pop icon at her most vulnerable and authentic. Charli XCX Alone Together is now streaming on Mubi US and Canada. As always, I am so grateful to partner with Mubi, as Mubi is a service I have genuinely used and loved for years that has allowed me to easily access and discover films that have since become my favorites. You can try Mubi for free for 30 days at mubi.com/finalgirlstudios for a whole month of great cinema for free. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to click the link in my description and visit Final Girl Digital on Substack, where I post original essay content such as Why the Female Gaze Does Not Exist, and extra videos such as monthly media digests, where I talk about the books, art, and media I consumed in the month. See you there!